global. Leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Ring Rees Mogg. Put your calls to Jacob Rees Mogg now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Good morning to you. 4 minutes after 9, Monday the 29th of October. It is indeed Ring Rees Mogg with prominent Conservative MP, chairs the ERG, Jacob Rees Mogg, who finds himself, no surprise here, on the front pages of some of your newspapers this morning because, Mr. Rees Mogg, you describe the possible budget or the ideas and details as they are emerging as a bribe to the electorate for being obedient. What do you mean by that, Mr. Rees Mogg?
Well, this is juxtaposed against the implied threat that if we don't accept whatever deal the Prime Minister comes up with, that there will then be an unpleasant budget later on. And this is just reminiscent of the George Osborne punishment budget that we were going to get before we voted to leave, saying that if you don't do what you're told by your political elders and betters, you will find that it's very unpleasant for you. And I don't think this is a good way to treat the electorate. I think the budget should be there to plan for all outcomes and should embrace the opportunity of leaving the European Union rather than taking a business-as-usual approach. Leaving the European Union is a very exciting opportunity.
But if you hold the great office of Chancellor and you think you foresee those problems, isn't it your duty to let the electorate know that?
Well, I think a sensible Chancellor...
I know you don't agree with those, but...
But I think a sensible Chancellor would look at the record of the Treasury in its forecast. What it has said about Brexit, how wrong it has been, how dog-in-the-manger-ish it's been. That is to say, it's made wrong forecasts, it's got embarrassed by them, and therefore it's become even more negative. And I think the Exchequer needs more leadership in this respect, of somebody like Nigel Lawson, who says that we can do it this way and have confidence in his own judgment rather than being tied up in the doom and gloom that the Treasury seems to exude.
So that's what a sensible Chancellor would do. Just before we go to calls, this man's not a sensible Chancellor, clearly.
Well, I think he's not giving the leadership to the Exchequer. He's going along with the doom and gloom, and he may, of course, believe in it himself. So he may be leading it, but to my mind, in the wrong direction.
And before the first call, more broadly, I'm sure you've studied the Sunday papers as I have, and we've got cash to fill in holes in the roads, cash for the army, cash for the NHS, cash to help young people with emotional or mental health issues. All that's pretty good news?
There's lots of good news. I would concentrate, I think, on ironing out the difficulties with universal credit, which I think is a very good system, but has some transition problems that are very serious.
Because it was denuded of cash by George Osborne a couple of years ago.
That's absolutely right. And I think, in retrospect, that was a mistake, and that money ought to be put back, and that's probably a priority. I'd be very cautious on the hypothecation of tax for roads. Hypothecation as a general rule doesn't work. It's always tempting to say there's this pool of money and it's ring-fenced. The difficulty is some years you have too little and some years you have too much. And it's better to take all taxation into a central pot and then work out what you need to spend the money on. So when the Chancellor talked about hypothecation in yesterday's TV programmes, I hope that's not a formal hypothecation.
OK. And lastly, is there a possible revolt growing about universal credit if more cash isn't found? There's some people who are muttering rather dark. Well, Conservatives love muttering dark. I wonder if they ever mutter anything other than darkly. Do you ever mutter anything than darkly?
I try and mutter sweetness and light
indeed,
on all occasions.
But there are dark mutters.
But I think there's a widespread opinion across the party that the universal credit is a good scheme and it needs to be implemented properly and fairly, and that it is very hard on people if they're going to lose significant amounts of money. And every MP has cases within his or her own constituency of this kind, and those need to be put right. So it's not so much dark mutterings or light mutterings, it's just a feeling that there is a problem and it needs addressing.
Let's go to the calls. Mark is in Brighton. You're through to Jacob Rees Mogg. Go ahead, Mark. Good morning to you.
Yes, good morning, Nick. Yes, good morning, Jacob.
Good morning, Mark.
Yes, my question is, and it's a little bit of a, I don't want to say hypothetical question, but I mean, I know you've been very loyal to the Prime Minister, and you know you seem to be very loyal to the Prime Minister, and that's very good of you. But do you think that if there were to be, say there was to be what's the word I'm looking for, a vote of confidence, and she was to be voted out, would you stand for high office, i.e., would you stand for something like Prime Minister, or better still, Chancellor?
Or better still, Chancellor. We'll visit that in a moment. Stay on the line, Mark.
Well, thank you, Mark. I don't think there's going to be a vacancy. I think the Prime Minister is going to remain. No, I know what the question was. I'm a backbench MP, and the history of the Conservative Party leadership is that when the Conservatives are in government, it's always gone to somebody who has held high office, which I haven't held. And therefore, I don't think it would be realistic of me to be campaigning for the leadership. Unfortunately, there are many other people within the party who would make very good leaders in the hypothetical circumstances, Mark, that you outline. And what is my real ambition is that we get Brexit delivered properly, and that we get it delivered in a way that we can identify on the 29th of March. That's what's important to me, is what I'm politically campaigning for, and I think is what the country wants. And I think the country's much more interested in that than the individuals.
Mark, you say better still, Chancellor. If you allow that the PM is top job, why would you say better still?
If you look at, not obviously going back years, because I'm 60 this year, so I remember quite a few, obviously, Prime Ministers and Chancellors. But if you look at modern history, shall we say Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, George Osborne, it strikes me that the Chancellor, and this might be, this is a personal opinion, so this isn't anything hard and fast, but it strikes me that the Chancellor was the power behind the throne, so to speak, yeah?
Yes.
It struck me that Tony Blair could do nothing without that he ran it past Gordon Brown first, and the same with George
David Cameron, George Osborne. Well, let's put that to Jacob. Is that true, the power behind the throne? Obviously, the spending power, without doubt.
Mark, I think you make a very interesting and important constitutional point, and is how our constitution has developed. And you see this, as you rightly say, with Gordon Brown and Tony Blair and George Osborne and David Cameron, that both of those people as Chancellor were instrumental to the government. One, I think, a very tense partnership, and the other a very close partnership, where the Prime Minister and Chancellor worked hand in glove to considerable effect. And I think that is how things have changed. And if you look back, if you look at Lord Thornycroft and Harold Macmillan, clearly Lord Thornycroft was not running the country in the way the Prime Minister was, and so it is a position that's evolved, and it's become slightly Chairman of the Board and Chief Executive. Whether that's a good thing is another matter, but it does seem to have evolved in that way.
Thank you for that, Mark. Noting what you say, Mr. Rees Mogg, that that Conservative history dictates one has to have served in some form of office, would you be interested in being Chancellor?
Well, there aren't any vacancies.
No, I appreciate that. But is it a job that might hold interest?
But this gets too speculative, because what matters is that Brexit is delivered. What I do is completely irrelevant. What is so in the country's interest is that we have a clear and clean break from the European Union, and that we're out. And
I think took a sort of more Brexity ticket, if you will.
But that's not the stage.
No, I know. And that's why I started the sentence with
I know. I'm still supporting the Prime Minister, and I want her to change and evolve the policy.
Well, before we move on to other matters, you have no aspirations for higher office?
No, I love being a backbench MP.
You don't want to be culture, media and sport, Northern Ireland, whatever it might be, ag and fish.
Miss Ferrari, to be your regulator, now you're beginning to tempt me.
But nothing else at the moment.
My ambition was to be elected to Parliament, and my ambition now is to get Brexit delivered.
Joel's in Cardiff. A different subject, I sense. Joel, go ahead. Good morning, sir. Joel, go ahead with your question. I think Joel... Well, I have the question here, so let me put it to you. Does Jacob Rees Mogg think the way Lord Hayne used parliamentary privilege was consistent with its intended use, was to be his question. We, of course, refer to the businessman Sir Philip Green, who denies certain wrongdoings.
Well, I think Joel's question is very important. Parliament is entitled to make things public that other people can't, and that's one of the great privileges from the Bill of Rights. It's an ancient privilege, it's an important privilege, but it's one that against the courts should be used with great care. The question I would raise on Lord Hayne's approach was that it was only an interim injunction, and in my view the full process should have been completed before deciding to interfere in the court's legitimate activities. Had this been a final injunction and the final court judgment, then I think to overturn it may be something a politician would want to do using parliamentary privilege. But I think it was done too early in the process, and it's very important that we maintain a separation between the courts and politics. Many politicians don't like it when the judges get political. Equally, the judges don't like it when the politicians interfere in the ordering of justice. So in my view, Lord Hayne would have been better advised to wait.
I sense you would not have done what Lord Hayne did.
Not at that point in the process.
But had we been through all courses of appeal...
I think that it would have been something that should have been made public, and had the Supreme Court finally ruled that there should be a permanent injunction, then I would be much more supportive of an MP revealing that. And I also think John Hemming, who revealed
the
former Lib Dem MP, a very good MP, actually.
The Ryan Giggs story, as I recall.
That's right. I think super injunctions were much more worrying in principle. The idea that you shouldn't even know that an injunction had been issued was, to my mind, far too big a constraint on freedom of speech. I think with anonymisation, it's reasonable to allow the court process to be completed.
And do you have a shred of sympathy then for Green, for Sir Philip? Sorry.
Sir Philip is a big enough public figure to take care of himself, and public figures know that if you get into public life, you will find that all the publicity around you is not invariably favourable, and that's just the way it is.
Let's see if we get a better line to Rebecca in Gosport. Rebecca, can you hear me? Good morning. Yes.
Good morning.
Go ahead. Your question to Jacob Rees Mogg. Thank you.
So universal credit. My husband died. I have a 6-year-old, and I'm bringing him up alone. I work, and I currently claim working tax credit. My circumstances are going to be changing ever so slightly, at which point I will be reassessed under universal credit rules, because by that time my area will have moved. Now, I'm going to lose about £300 a month, and I think that's primarily because some of my income comes from my late husband's pension, occupational pension. Right. I think widows and widowers seem particularly penalised because of this, and I just want to know, how will this be put right? You say there are...
and before Mr Rees Mogg answers, can you just... I mean, £300 are going out of anyone's budget, I suggest they're going to feel. What will the impact be, the real impact be for you, Rebecca, and your son?
Do you know, I'm almost too scared to consider that at the moment.
Right. OK, we'll stay on the line. Jacob Rees Mogg.
Well, Rebecca, thank you for calling. And can I encourage you to get in touch with your own MP, who may be able to help you and should certainly take your case up. The circumstances you outline are exactly why so many people think that reforms need to be made to the universal credit to ensure that people in your position don't lose out in this way, that... universal credit is a good system in that it helps people into work and means that work always pays, and that is the most successful route out of poverty. But that to have a system that takes £300 a month out of people's pockets, particularly widows' pockets, shows that there is a failure in the implementation. And I can only apologise and say that as somebody who voted for the universal credit, I'm very concerned that it's working in this way. And what you highlight and what listeners will be hearing today will make many people think that some reform needs to be made to ensure this doesn't happen, and to recognise that if there is money available to be spent in this budget, sorting out problems like the one you refer to would be my priority, even over and above adding to the road building projects.
Let me ask you, Rebecca, there's no reason why you should. Do you happen to know who your MP is?
Yes, I've written to her, Carolyn Dinage.
Right, OK. Have you had a response?
I have had a response, they can't go any further until I'm actually claiming universal credit, at which point I fear it'll be too late.
I see. Yes,
the transitional payments won't support me, because I will need reassessment, and once you're reassessed, once your circumstances change, once you're reassessed, then it's a new claim.
This is the fault of implementation, Mr Rees Mogg, you were talking about, isn't it? Because it's causing you and other Conservatives a lot of worry.
It's causing me great concern, because I've had people come to my own constituency surgery in similar positions. I can't go into details because obviously their situations are confidential, but it's a matter of great concern, and that the whole point of transition is to ensure that people moving from one benefit to another don't have a large cost of doing so. That it's benefits have from time to time to be reformed, but the hardest reform of benefit, and the one that needs the most focus on transition, is people whose circumstances haven't changed, but whose benefit has changed.
Yes.
And they need to be protected.
It's disempowering.
Absolutely, and it appears to be the faceless bureaucracy not considering the individual. And as a Conservative, I always believe in putting the individual first. Now, you may say this is expensive. Actually, I think the universal credit, because of the way it encourages people to work, will in fact be a system.
But I am working.
Indeed, but I was meaning more generally. Sorry, I wasn't meaning in your specific case. Is one that will more than pay for itself, but should be fair in transition.
I wonder if you'd stay on the line, Rebecca. We'd like to take your details. Often it helps. Not if the system can't be moved, but sometimes if there's media interest, a case is perhaps advanced a little bit, and yours does seem desperately unfair, as Mr. Rees Mogg says. But then if the system is constructed thus, it's difficult to see a way through. But please stay on the line, because if you're prepared, we'll perhaps try and explore that a little bit more, and it allows me to move on. Rebecca, let's hope the situation resolves itself. We move to other issues. Justin in Walthamstow, you're through to Jacob Rees Mogg. Justin, go ahead. Good morning, sir.
Hello, Jacob. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Justin.
I was recently called into your colleague Darren's show. They were discussing Sajid Javid and his recent
Yes, indeed.
where he said, I'm quoting Sajid Javid here, he wrote on Twitter, "These sick Asian paedophiles are finally facing justice."
Yes, this was after the Huddersfield case, in which, as I from memory, 15 Asian males, mostly of Pakistani origin, were convicted of about a 7-year reign of grooming and effectively farming out young women. He, the Home Secretary, then got in enormous trouble for using the word Asian. Is that the point you're driving at with Jacob Rees Mogg?
That's right. Sajid Javid has also quoted that he's acting on research provided to him by the Quilliam Foundation.
Yes, indeed. OK. Jacob Rees Mogg, a clumsy use of the word Asian, or acceptable? Where would you stand on that?
I think we've got to be very careful of hypersensitivity about phraseology. I think the Home Secretary is entitled to phrase himself the way he chooses, and that he...
But I'm Japanese, I'm from Asia. That's not very fair.
Well, that's true.
Asia, big continent.
Yes, but to narrow it down by continent is, I think, not unreasonable. And I don't think people are so unthoughtful that they assume that means everybody in Asia is responsible.
I think it could be Indian, though, and mostly it's Pakistani, not wholly, but mostly.
Asia covers the whole continent. I don't think that saying Asian is particularly outrageous. I think we are becoming very, very sensitive as a society to anything that people don't like being said. What if you're Pakistani, but it's from one part of Pakistan and not from the other? How specific do you have to be when you make these statements? And I think what the Home Secretary said was not factually inaccurate.
No, it's not.
And that most people would have understood precisely what he meant. And therefore I do not take exception to it.
If you were Indian, you might, lastly. When it is mostly, I repeat, mostly Pakistan.
Absolutely. I think most people in India would know that it wasn't referring to them, that it's like using the term European, that there are many different cultures within Europe, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to use the term European to refer to individuals.
Quick response from you, Justin, from what you've heard?
Completely inaccurate. And Sajid Javid, although you say he can address it how he wishes, he has people that listen to him, and he should address it factually. When you look at the figures that he's studying from Quilliam, they're saying that 84% of the grooming convictions for grooming gangs. So we're not talking about paedophiles, although they are paedophiles. We're looking more specifically at grooming gangs.
Yes.
He should have changed the word paedophile to grooming gang convictions. And
No.
They were paedophiles. Let's be honest about this. They were attacking underage children, and they are disgusting paedophiles, and let's not mince our words about that.
No, but they were more specifically, they were grooming gang convictions.
Well, they were grooming paedophiles. I don't think that we're arguing about the difference between a louse and a flea on this particular issue. They are disgusting individuals who deserve to be imprisoned for what they've done. And I think to argue over one word or another on their revolting habits is neither here nor there.
I think
the use of the word Asian, I mean, I've got friends in Holland, they have an almost identical problem, but they don't have Asian grooming gangs, or as some people call them, Pakistani grooming gangs. They have Moroccan grooming gangs.
Right. OK. Well, we're getting into an era I don't know, which causes a degree of concern. But let's just remember the timing of this, lastly, Justin, which was that the Home Secretary was either responding on the afternoon of or the day after the conviction of those men in Huddersfield, those sick paedophiles in Huddersfield. So it's totally pertinent, I would suggest, as to what he was saying, although I get the debate about the use of the word Asian. Justin, thank you. Let's not talk about Holland, where I'm not really sure what's happening there, but I do know we can move to Ian in Morecambe. Ian, you're on the radio. Your question, if you would, to Jacob Rees Mogg. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, and good morning to you, Jacob.
Good morning, Ian. Thank you for calling.
Good morning. Thanking Nick and the team as well for allowing me to...
Not at all. Wouldn't have a show without you. Move to your question, if you would, sir.
American political discourse has become an increasingly toxic brand over recent years. Now, has Donald Trump helped increase this toxicity and made the situation worse by, in brackets, inciting violence, with recent wording such like destruction on destruction, and recently saying guns on guns is a remedy for that poor hapless synagogue that was taken apart last week by a lone wolf, causing multiple deaths? And secondarily, Jacob, would you briefly comment on how you could help ameliorate America's gun culture in order to reduce repeated mass killings of the nature that they suffer in an almost conveyor belt type way these days?
Stay on the line. A couple of issues for you there, Mr. Rees Mogg.
Well, I think on the second question, for me to ameliorate the problem of American gun culture is outside my remit. I could give some thoughts on how I would do it, but the American political system is very different from ours. And it's worth bearing in mind that the amendment to the US Constitution that maintains the right to bear arms is directly lifted from our Bill of Rights. Our Bill of Rights maintains the right to bear arms for the maintenance of a Protestant militia, which from my point of view as a Catholic, it's reassuring that this right has been limited in subsequent years. But the point on language is, I think, the fundamental one, Ian. And I believe in conducting political discourse in broadly moderate language. That's not to say that on some occasions it's worth using a pithy phrase to highlight something, but by and large political discourse should be even-tempered and well-mannered. It is perfectly possible to disagree with people politely, and that's how democracy ought to work. American political culture has always been, regardless of Donald Trump, much more aggressive than the UK's political culture.
Why do you suppose that is?
Well, it may be to do with the frontier nature of the United States. It may be to do with its history. It may be to do with the First Amendment, freedom of speech. So it's much easier to say things in America, and adverts on radio and television in the US are very punchy compared to ours, which are more cautious. Though when you look at what our political debate was like in the 19th century and quite how rude Disraeli was willing to be, he called Gladstone a shoplifter. I mean, he really didn't mince his words at all. Ours has developed into a more polite conversation in comparison with the US, and I think that's beneficial for our politics. But Donald Trump operates in the political atmosphere in which he operates.
So has he fueled hate and hate incidents, whether it be hate speech or the worst scale possible attacks on synagogues?
I think it's wrong to blame Donald Trump for murderous people who go into synagogues and commit wicked acts. I don't think there's any direct or indirect link to what he has said. I think that's much more to do with America's gun culture. And you've got to understand, to go to the second part of the question, the difficulty for America is that they're starting from where they're starting from, where there are so many guns in the country, and that if you were simply to make it illegal for the law-abiding, you probably don't do anything about the non-law-abiding because of the quantities that are there.
He took 4 guns into the synagogue. It's quite extraordinary.
It is terrible.
And lastly, the suggestion is that now they might be looking at posting men or women with guns on the doors of synagogues.
Yes. And
as a man of faith, admittedly I know you're a Catholic, that must just make your heart sink.
Well, it is desperately sad, but as I understand it, a lot of synagogues in the UK have security, not armed security, but unarmed security, and we should be very worried about that we shouldn't always just point the finger at the US. We should sometimes think about what is wrong within our own society.
Ian, thank you. Let's try and get at least one more in. Steve in Southend. Steve, you're through to Jacob Rees Mogg. Go ahead, Steve. Morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm one of 2.6 million UK military veterans in the country. I served in Afghanistan, and I've also experienced the issues with mental health and try to live with that through careers. Just some sort of stats on this. Royal British Legion provide £49 million on welfare allocations each year, whereas the government's only investing £22 million a year on veteran mental health. What's more alarming and bordering on scandalous is that the government don't record any data on suicides in UK military veterans, which is not in line with other NATO countries that do hold that data and respond to it.
I'm going to have to move you to... Yes, thank you, sir.
My question is, why isn't the government doing enough to support military veterans with mental health problems, given the wars that they've been involved in the last 15 years?
Well, Steve, first of all, thank you for your public service, that there is no nobler calling than to be willing to take up arms for the sake of one's country and to risk life and limb to do that. So thank you very much. It's more than I've ever done for my country, so I salute you. And I think the issue you raise is one that is becoming a matter of great concern, and it's perhaps been a hidden problem, and that the more people know about it, the more the government will want to do it about it to help and to support. There are support mechanisms for former soldiers. Sometimes they're not publicised enough, so people don't know that they're available. There is a general change in society towards mental health, not specifically for the military, and there's going to be increased government spending within the NHS to try and help people with mental health problems. So I think overall things are moving in the right direction, but I accept your point that this has come late and that it should have been a higher level of concern for many years, for the state to look after those who have been willing potentially to sacrifice everything for the country.
Steve, thank you for that. We have to bring a curtain down, so no more time to come back to you, save for this is absolutely unsubstantiated, just breaking the suggestion that Angela Merkel may be quitting as the head of her Christian Democratic Party after nearly 2 decades. In fact, this is unconfirmed news coming out of a European news source. Were it true, how should we remember her politically?
Well, we should remember her when people retire or resign. One should remember them for the extraordinary contribution they have made to their country. She is a patriotic German lady who has held fast to her political beliefs for a very extended period in the highest office, and one should draw a curtain over the day-to-day political disputes and what we were talking about, polite political debate. Today, if this is right,
yes,
is a day to say kindly things about her.
What about tomorrow?
And tomorrow we can consider what the effect will have on the Brexit negotiations and more earthy matters.
Yes. Has she been a friend to Britain?
Let's think about that tomorrow.
All right. If I were to say to you, and that is unconfirmed, that is merely coming from a news source in Europe, that's all we're saying. One thing I can confirm, if I was to say to you that they're getting rid of our poo, Mr. Rees Mogg, would you have the slightest clue what I was talking about?
It sounds like one of the jokes my children might make. It sounds rather rude.
He's a Simpsons character. Your children aren't into the Simpsons?
No, I'm not into the Simpsons. No, I've never been into them, and no, nor my children.
But no. I would imagine, lastly...
If you were to ask me about Peppa Pig, I'm really quite an expert on that.
I'll have that for 2 weeks' time, I promise. Do you allow your children to watch Disney films? I ask this because there's been a bit of a storm. Cinderella is apparently demeaning to women. Little Mermaid, which I confess I've never seen. Are the Disney movies regularly watched in the Rees Mogg?
Who do you think in the Rees Mogg household knows how to work the remote controls? Me or my children? You know, I do as I'm told. I'm a very obedient father.
You just watch Cinderella as it goes.
Whatever's on.
All right, I'll have a Peppa Pig test for you in a couple of... And I will, by the way, I will. Jacob Rees Mogg appearing here on LBC 9:32. News is next.
It's being reported the German Chancellor Angela Merkel will quit as head of her Christian Democratic Union party after nearly 2 decades in charge. It comes after the country's governing parties lost significant support in a state election.